You started out with the idea of making the strange familiar and the familiar strange. Is there a connection to that phrase and the book that you just showed?
Yes, yes.
Can you say more about connecting those two things, like the three places that you take them to?
Maybe a good place to start would be my own journey.
Yes.
Because when I first came to the UK, and I'm a curious person by nature, and one of the things that struck me was that cars don't horn and dogs don't bark in this country. What's
Yes.
wrong? What's wrong with people here? And a lot of time was spent in making the strange familiar. These are strange things, and how do you start to live with this a completely different worldview? How do you
Yes.
coexist? Because you come from a completely different belief system. And the more you look at it, the more you're fighting with yourself to say, is there something wrong with you? Is there something wrong with the people here?
Yes.
And what you come to realize after a while is that, this is the power of culture, that it is remarkably coherent from within, but it makes very little sense from the outside.
Mhm.
And so you need a degree of comfort to walk into another culture and look at things curiously. So that was one
Yes.
aspect of it. How do you make the strange familiar? The other aspect of it is that how do you make the familiar strange, which is things that I have lived with for my life. Even today, if you offer me a cup of tea or coffee, I would prefer a cup of tea. Or very, so I'm very comfortable, for example, to use a certain gestures, for example. I use a lot of gestures when I speak, and it's always stayed with me. So, but putting a mirror on my face to say, this is what the obvious is, and making it a little bit strange to your own self. A lot of things that I do, for example, when
Mhm.
I work with leaders, is that I just record their conversation on a phone and play it back
Yeah.
to them. And watching your own self, which it is so uncomfortable
Yes.
because you've never seen yourself. You've never seen yourself. So how do you make the familiar strange to people? And the idea of this book was precisely that you take people to a Presbyterian church, and most people will say, what is there to question in the symbol of a cross? This has been passed on to people through generations. Of it, people don't even question. Why do the seats in the church have to be so uncomfortable? Why? Why is the orientation of the church have to be in a particular direction? Why do the entrance door has to be so high? Because it's all
Mm.
of space and height is all about power. You take people to somewhere very familiar where they have stopped questioning the obvious. And the IB gets so furious when people make mistakes at work because that's a very, very familiar place for them. They've stopped questioning the obvious. The next day, you take them to a very strange place like a Hindu temple if you are living in the West, and you do, a Ganesh Puja ritual, the Hindu deity, the elephant deity, you do is ritual. And suddenly you see that most people who live in the West, their language falls apart. There's no way they can explain any of this because, all those symbols, myths, rituals, that
Yeah.
language, which makes perfect sense to somebody else, I have no language to explain any of that. So what is happening in that moment is that you're not able to make the strange familiar.
Mm.
And third, you take them to the Apple store and you show them how a world leading brand actually capitalizes on all this intelligence because there can be nothing more powerful than the symbols and the rituals of the Apple store. They are
Mm.
so remarkably coherent. And what people say is that often to me is that they must have spent a lot of money training people in this direction. I said, no, they don't. They and genuinely put culture on top of processes because if they get their culture right, that it's very, very easy to implement process. And not easy, but it's much more, I would say, comparatively easier. If you get this is the idea of making the familiar strange and the strange familiar within a cultural context. Yes.
Awesome. Um, you mentioned the word culture, and then you mentioned the word process. There are two distinct questions that come to mind. So let me ask the first one. I come from a cybersecurity background. And so many times, let's say there is a small security incident or whatever, then the big boss is going to say, hey, look, let's go in with a hammer and make sure that all developers who make this mistake, we slap them on the wrist, or, let's ban this in our corporate policy, security policy and standard and procedures. Kind of really a top-down command and control type of, okay, once it's written there, everybody has to agree to the terms, and everybody who violates it is seen as somebody who's making a mistake. Clearly, that has not been a successful strategy in terms of getting, you want commitment from people, not conformance or, short-term compliance. And so how does Apple make that happen? What is that difference in their approach that makes this happen?
Where do I start? I mean, I was intrigued when I first started watching Apple's approach to everything. Let's take a very simple example. Um, Laksh, you
Mhm.
enter into the store, and the first thing is you're greeted by somebody, try to make a personal connection with you, regardless of wherever you go in the world. If you're wearing an Apple Watch and if you're holding an Apple product, that could be a really good conversation starter. And they try not to come across as somebody who pushes anything on you. They are not sales. They just want to build a relationship with you. If there is a particular product that is not available off the shelf, they would never say it's not available. They would say it's available online. At the back of it, there's a place which is called Genius Bar, and there's a lot of space. Space is like everything, and they really amplify the products in the background of that enormous space. My point is that they have achieved a certain level of cultural maturity. Also, the ritual, when it comes to the symbols, when it comes to the myths, when it comes to logos, nothing on Apple walls, nothing at all. Not a single word means anything if it does not do any call to action. See a particular product, or see Apple Intelligence, talk to one of our colleagues. And my point is this, that they have pioneered the idea of shared understanding. This is where we were coming from earlier, that, they spend a lot less time pushing their processes onto people and trying to come up with some kind of a shared understanding. Because shared understanding lives in the body and not in the brain, a lot of it is achieved through cultural intelligence. They try to make people intuitively intelligent. So, for example, if 10 people in Apple are following that ritual, that every time a customer enters into the office, into this, and he has or she has to be greeted in a particular way, you would be an idiot if you did not follow those 10 people, if you are an employee, because every employee, every culture seeks a sense of belonging. So it's
Yes.
not so much about training and processes. They really, really create some symbols and myths and logos. And we can talk about that. But, I'm just giving one example. But the idea is that when you are culturally intelligent, you understand how to create a sense of shared understanding, not through training and process, which goes here and then comes out from here.
Yeah.
I was just listening to your words actually as you were speaking, that, I think inherent to much of this thinking that people don't follow processes or they violate processes in your own words
Mm.
actually goes back to a very simple idea that people are conscious of the decisions.
Yeah.
98% of the times, people are not consciously making those. So if you
Yes.
go into that space of training them and retraining them or punishing them, what you're doing is you're punishing somebody who doesn't even know why they did what they did. But if you
Yes.
took a few minutes to understand what they meant, what you would see is that they have probably not understood what you meant to say. And through that
Mm.
shared understanding, through that somatic mapping, a lot of these misunderstandings are clarified. And
Awesome.
this is where you develop that shared understanding which lives in the body and between the bodies. It does not live in the brain.
That's interesting. The words we use necessarily may not mean the same thing to us. And when you say the word culture, I discuss with a lot of people from the complexity sciences background. And when they use that word culture in an organizational setting, the typical position is that culture is an emergent phenomenon, as in you cannot design for emergence. And, or in other words, culture is like a shadow, it's read only. You cannot go and manipulate it and change it as you wish. And so when you talk about culture, what do you mean by that? And so can we double click and go into maybe how do you go about getting that shared understanding? And when you say when it's in the body, what do you mean? Isn't all thinking, everything in my brain, is that not it? What do you mean in the body? And how do you get that shared understanding?
I think you already said that in the beginning or some in the middle, that you used one particular author and I use another one. There is no difference between what you're saying and me. Let's go back to the basics of human mind. You said, you said something along the lines of brain, and absolutely along the same lines. The brain is not the control tower. The brain is a
Mm.
warehouse that coordinates between different minds. So, you are an embodied mind. the whole body is a mind. So what the brain does, it coordinates between different minds. But the important thing to understand is that the brain does not control the body. And the moment you let go of this idea, you start to think about the human mind in a different way that people can, when they make, so somebody has spent 20, 30 years doing a job in a particular way, they're not doing it from their conscious mind. Their habits, their heuristics, their rituals, their metaphors, their slogans, their symbols, their behaviors, their narratives, what it shows is it's a certain level of unconscious. And that
Yes.
unconscious is shared within the organization. So what is culture? Culture is what we share unconsciously between us. We are not aware of it. And what good organizations do is they work really, really hard to create consistent symbols,
Yeah.
consistent habits, consistent metaphors, consistent logos. You look at the Apple logo, for example. I keep going back to Apple because, it's
yes.
good to anchor onto something concrete.
Mhm.
But if you look at what Apple does is it is not just an apple, it's a bitten apple. An apple actually starts an unconscious story within. To a young person who's very much into bytes and information, that apple has one meaning. But the actual meaning of all that is a quest for perfection, which starts from the Garden of Eden. But, it's a story. It could have been a full apple, but it's a bitten apple. And the bitten
Yes.
apple is the story of the forbidden fruit. It's said to go in that direction. And now for the rest of your life, you have to perfect yourself. And how powerfully that myth speaks to people unconsciously. Any organization which has a consistent set of symbols, rituals, habits, metaphors, artifacts on the wall, for example, slogans, Nike says, just do it. What a wonderful, powerful symbol it is. And so
Yeah.
my point is really this, that when you are culturally mature, when you're culturally intelligent, you understand the embodied nature of human mind. You understand that all decision making is unconscious, or most of it is unconscious. You spend a lot more time influencing people in that area. I mean, look at what the president of the United States is doing. He's doing it in another way and for another reason, but semiotically, culturally, so consistent with his message. Republicans have always been a lot more consistent with their message as against the Democrats because they come from a very consistent metaphor. They're meant consistent.
Awesome. Does it then come down to symbols and design and storytelling and metaphors? What are some of the tools that a leader can use to create these type of shared understanding? Maybe if you want to explain it with the same Apple example, that'd be awesome too.
Yeah, so we call it the culture cloud, and I'm happy to send you the cloud metaphor. The idea of using the word cloud as a metaphor for culture is that once you're inside the culture, you can't see it because you're inside the cloud.
Yes.
But it's so visible from the outside. That's one. Cloud like culture is an ecosystem. It's always in turbulence. It's always in turbulence. It's
Yes.
always many other reasons. But within that cloud, what the cloud offers is when you get into the cloud, offers a very, very consistent worldview, remarkably coherent and consistent worldview to people who belong to that culture. And what does that mean? A few components: habits, heuristics, behaviors, even under stress. For example, you might be a very calm and consistent person, but when you're pressured, you're a completely different person. We all know that. But
Yeah.
so narratives, how you write narratives, how you create artifacts on the wall, how you place those artifacts on the wall, what sort of symbols, what sort of slogans, what sort of metaphors, what sort of generalizations, stereotypes, spin, language, discourse. So there are about 9 or 10 components within the culture, particularly within the framework of an organization, that you should start thinking about making them more consistent. And Laksh, from years of experience, what I see is that the low-hanging fruits are things like, for example, artifacts. One of the I was working with in Asia, they had a very high suicide rate within the employees. And one of the things you see at the entrance of the office is a slogan to say, "What are you proud of today?" And put that in a box. It's a anonymous box, confidential reporting. And my first point was that this is an organization that culturally does not know how to engage with people. So when you have suicides, and you have people entering into the office first thing in the morning, what sort of a question, what thoughts would it trigger to people? So what you do is so artifacts, things that you place on the walls and policies. This is the low hanging fruits which you can start to make more consistent. The longest is the language in the organization. For example, when it comes to things like leadership, comes to things like human resources, when it comes to things like security, risk, safety, what language do we want to promote in the organization? And you'll be surprised, when the organizations that get it right are the ones who dare to actually go back to their people to say, okay, we use this word, let's say, Apple intelligence in this. What does it mean to you? So you spend a lot more time making sure that people come to some kind of a shared understanding of that culture cloud. Because if you don't have that, if you don't have a shared understanding, it can easily lead to subcultures. To answer your question, the most important thing is to work towards a common language, a shared language. And the easiest way to do it is to start working on your artifacts. What is it that you display on the walls? Slowly towards the language. And that's the hardest bit. It takes time.
Yeah. How does this play out in a remote world that we live today? Of course, a lot of companies are asking their employees to come back into the office. Have you found any techniques to do this remotely over like video conferencing?
You mean to say, in what sense, Laksh?
Like actually, typically, leaders embark on a transformation, organizational transformation or culture change. And so if you're saying, culture is so much dependent on artifacts and what you like, all those things in the office, there's going to be a percentage of your employees who never go to the office. How does, depending on the size, how does their perception and worldview and understanding of those words and language and meaning, is it going to deviate? How much is the physical artifact more significant than language and metaphors and stories?
The short answer is yes, it is possible to have a very consistent set of, not consistent so much, but it's not so much about being consistent that everyone should have a banner at the back and of
Yes.
the company's logo. I think what is the most important thing is to dare to ask the question that Laksh, I see some books at the back of your screen. Tell me a little bit about those books. It's having that curiosity to open up the obvious. When we started this conversation, I asked, you always wear this blue shirt, or as I see you, what is the story behind it? So I think it's a culturally intelligent person would start to ask those questions. Like I said, I went into that office, I saw that box, what are you proud of? Is to start asking those questions. And the interesting thing is, because the other person will always has taken those things for granted, they will be surprised. Why are you even asking that question? This is something that will be sitting there for 20 years. So as much as you are trying to make the strange familiar, the other person is trying to make the familiar strange. And this is where you start to come to some kind of shared understanding. Okay, we have been using this Apple logo for so long. How many people actually dare to understand the hidden meaning in it? And slowly you start to come to understand that there is so much that we do not understand about each other. And that's where the organization starts to work towards shared understanding. It's all in the language, Laksh. It's all in the language, yeah.
So let's say you start a transformation, and even though you try to use the same language and be consistent with your framing, let's say you start noticing different subcultures. When you say, when you're not doing this right, obviously subcultures may emerge. If a leader starts noticing, what maneuvers can one use to go and kind of make course corrections?
I think the starting point is to know where the culture of the organization is. And we do a diagnosis of the culture of the organization. So for example, if you're dealing with a startup, there are four kinds of subcultures, let's say, or competing values. So every organization is bureaucratic. Every organization is adhocratic, which is ad hoc. Every organization is autocratic, and every organization is democratic. Every organization has an element of rule following, bureaucracy, adhocracy, which is very much needed for innovation in Silicon Valley, for example. Autocracy, you need to respect your leaders, and democracy, in a sense that you take people along when you make decisions, you consult with them. Every organization has all those four competing values. The trouble is sometimes some organizations become too heavy in one direction, too heavy. So when you diagnose the culture of the organization, certain values start to emerge. For example, the head office is most of the times very heavy on bureaucracy and autocracy. Let's say you have a head office somewhere in the world, and they genuinely believe that people are following processes, and you must respect your leaders, people who are sitting high up in the hierarchy. Until you go to the site or a branch office, and they are fighting day to day, for example. So they are very autocratic and they are very democratic. Democratic because they're a small bunch of people and they genuinely believe in having conversations every day before they wrap up. So you create the democratic, and which is not a bad thing. The important thing is to diagnose the culture of the organization and see where the organization has leaned more. So we have 45 questions that we ask. And from there, you get a very, very good understanding of where the organization is and where it wants to be. You want to be an organization that wants to control everything through process. Then do you have, we go back to the culture cloud. Do we have the right metaphors? Do we have the right slogans? Do we have the right symbols? Do we have the right behaviors, the narratives, the way we actually write stories of failures and successes, emphasizing more on bureaucracy, for example, or are we not? So what happens is that the diagnosis actually brings out which of those 4 competing values in which part of the organization has become too heavy or too less. So we try to bring all 4 in balance by very strategic interventions through the culture cloud that I mentioned to you. I have a video, I can send it to you, but the whole idea is to make sure that every penny that you spend in cultural transformation is actually strategically going in the direction of making the organization more balanced in all those 4 competing values.
Interesting. Do the 4 always have to be in balance? Rather, I should ask the question, what do you mean by imbalance? And does it change as the environment changes?
Yeah, I live in a safety and learning world, and most people genuinely start to believe that an organization is all about safety or keeping people safe, or it's all about learning, which is the autocracy of it. And I always say to people that it is not the case. You're looking at the organization from one point of view. So by balance, what I mean is that there should be an element of learning. There should be an element of respecting and following the rules. And if not, we need to understand why. There should be an element of respecting the leadership. And if not, why? For example, things like Me Too campaign don't just come out from nowhere. They're regular and consistent and a pervasive, toxicity within the organization that has led us to in that situation. And that every now and then we need to give people a sense of belonging. So what I mean by balance is that we need to have all those 4 areas, all those 4 competing values. Now, the next thing is that, where do you strategically want to position yourself? If you are an organization that takes pride in selling burgers, by involving semi-skilled workers and giving them a checklist or a process to do their work, then obviously you will want to focus more on bureaucracy. You want to make sure that people understand whatever processes you are creating. So in that sense, you need to be more strategic. But Laksh, the most important thing is to do a diagnosis to see where in the organization we have a problem, or which part of the organization, where are they in this mapping process. And from there, you can start to, for example, if you are focusing on innovation, you cannot tell them to be more bureaucratic. The innovative people will say, okay, then why spend money on research and development if you want us to follow the rules? So you have to strategically then align yourself in that area, depending on whatever your ambitions are.
What you said totally resonates with me because I come from the software field. And when you try to centralize and standardize a set of development frameworks and the CI/CD pipeline or whatever, you're basically trying to create efficiencies, right? If everybody uses the same thing, the cost can go down. But then it completely destroys innovation because when there's a new problem arises, these set of tools and frameworks and languages just doesn't work. And so you chase efficiency and you've really compromised your long-term viability because innovation becomes more and more difficult. And so these type of lenses, you can frame it in different ways, like the short term versus the long term and so on and so forth. I think this type of thinking actually brings forth all of these blind spots that leaders typically have. So what you say totally resonates with me. Let me pivot to a couple of other keywords, which is the safety, accidents, and also learning. And so connecting these things, learning from accidents. I know that's one of your books, and I'm going to basically translate that to the tech world here in Silicon Valley. And many Silicon Valley corporations, they have this process called as the Blameless Post-Mortem. And so when like a security incident happens, or even like a production incident happens, like for example, like Facebook.com goes down for a couple of hours, it's a big problem, right? And so typically the process says you should not blame any engineer or any developer or whoever it is, but we should come up with ways by which we can fix it systemically. You add checks and balances within the tool chain. Yet, many times in the organizational context, blame does get assigned, even in those organizations that typically call for blameless postmortems, because those incidents are then used to give that developer a C rating. And so eventually that person, gets eliminated in the next layoff cycle. And so blame gets placed in different ways. Do you see that in your line? Like, you don't necessarily deal with software, but in other parts of the world, like manufacturing, whatever. Yeah.
It's no different.
Yeah.
A lot of organizations are struggling with this idea of being, first of all, there is no such thing like blameless or a blame-free culture. We have to get rid of this idea. It's 3,000 years of history, or maybe even more, actually, if you go back to Ramayana and Mahabharata from our times. It's a complete delusion to say that there can ever be a blameless society. In the face of an accident, in the face of misfortune, we will always find someone or something to blame. You can just forget that. No, it's a too noble. It's something that sounds very well, but it has no substance at all, because it defies the basic human nature, which is reciprocity. When Gandhi used to say, "An eye for an eye makes the whole world blind," but that's what it is. It will always be that way. But I think what you can start to think about is that how do you ask questions when something goes wrong? And, I can talk about the techniques of questioning, Laksh. For example, instead of saying, "Why did you do that?" you could say, "Can you tell me more about this?" Or, "Can you tell me a little bit about this?" Or, "Would you like to share with me about this incident?" And just stop there. You don't ask another question. But the fundamental thing, as we have been discussing from the beginning, is that coming to terms with the idea that 98% of decisions are not made in the conscious mind. So what are you to gain from asking probing questions that actually reflect that the human being made decisions in the conscious space? Now, you meditate on all the questions that we ask, Laksh. Why did you do that? Why did you not consider this? Why did you not follow the process? All these questions actually at the back, or what is the logic behind it? Can you see why? The 5 whys and so on. See, the thing that we are not coming to grips with is that these things were never thought through by somebody who's been in the field for 10, 20, 30 years. They were not making decisions from the conscious mind. So what are we to gain by asking those questions? And so once you come to terms with the idea that human beings make unconscious decisions, and I want to help them improve in the unconscious space, I want to make them intuitively more intelligent, then the line of questioning changes completely from there. So when something happens, you say, you walk into the field and say, "Okay, can you please help me? Can you please share with me what's happening here?" And suddenly, or "Can you tell me about this? Or can you walk me through this? Can you talk me through this?" What you're doing is you're giving the person the opportunity to speak from the unconscious mind. And if you're able to somatically map in on a whiteboard, it's wonderful. It's the way you make the person realize that, a lot of these decisions were made from the unconscious mind. So you have made the unconscious conscious. And if you ask me what is learning, that's what it is. It's making the unconscious conscious. That is what learning is.
Yeah.
You have unlearned, you have learned something new, and possibly there will be no blaming. Possibly.
So the set of questions, as you put it, that we ask underpins the idea that we make decisions through conscious brain. Like that position, it is very profound. It has deep implications on the field of cybersecurity, for example, on safety. I mean, profound in so many different ways, from management and leadership too. But why isn't this in the mainstream consciousness? Why do we still live in a world where we act as if everyone's making conscious, rational, logical decisions? Of course, they do it in some decisions, but go back to cybersecurity, because one of the things that we talk about is the phishing awareness training, where, you get sent a malicious email that appears to be from one of your colleagues or the CEO, and then there's an attachment or there's a link, and they click it, and then their passwords are compromised, their computer gets taken over, and all bad things happen from there. And so then the clear position of the cybersecurity industry is we must make sure that they attend the annual phishing exam and training, or when they do these fake simulations, the people who fail that must be blamed and they must be given additional training. So that is the dominant paradigm today here in Silicon Valley. How would you change that? What can these cybersecurity professionals who have now understood, or at least they know from you or listening to this podcast, this fundamental assumption has broken down? What do I change? How do I change?
Say that the hardest thing, we started from ego, and that's what it is. We started from power and control. That's what it is. And this is what differentiates between a leader and a manager. A leader is not about ego. I remember meeting a handful of people. They don't even put their designation on their business card. They don't care. The most silent person sitting in the room at the back doesn't care. There's no ego. They've realized there's nothing in that space. So a very simple answer to your question is letting go of what you already know, because this is a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword, and letting go of what you already know and seeing the beauty in that person, seeing the depth of expertise in that person, realizing that 98% of the decisions are made in the unconscious, realizing that 20, 30 years of expertise, actually, this is very interesting what you said, for one simple reason, that counterintuitive to everything that we know today about expertise, experts don't think when they make decisions. Decision making is in the body. And so it intrigues people, it frustrates us, but the very reason you hired them is because they were efficient. Because if they were to think, they will not. You might as well hire an apprentice who will go by the procedure diligently. The essence of all expertise is that they don't think. The trouble is you don't spend enough time to make them intuitively intelligent. All your processes, particularly when things go wrong, your ways of interrogating people fall back on the rational mind, the logical mind. And so you lose any opportunity to strengthen people in that space. So here are a few questions to make people intuitively intelligent. Shall I read out to you?
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah. Can you step me through? Where would you like to start? Can you tell me about? Can you tell me more about? What are the stages of this job? Listen to this. What are the stages of this job? I'm not interested in the process. I'm interested in your stages, your unconscious. Yeah. Can you give me an example of, is there any more you'd like to say? Would you like more time? And what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is give control to that expert, because that's why you employed that person. So why wouldn't you ask that question when it's most needed, in the moments of learning and discovery? Because the moment you ask a question, a leading question, that shows only two things. Either that problem exists in that space or not. So you're trying to validate your hypothesis and nothing else. But if you ask an open question, you might discover something that you didn't know. And that's the essence of all engagement.
Yeah.
It's in the unconscious, Laksh.
Yeah.
And most people know how to ask questions.
Yes. Which leads me to the question, why didn't you speak up at that time when I asked you, when I asked everyone, why didn't you speak up to, is there anything you'd like to tell me?
I've dedicated a chapter to that question in my book. Why didn't you speak up? It's the Concordia exam, the ship.
Yes. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to, because, there were two subcultures on the bridge of the ship. There was a captain who was 59 years old, experiential to the pinnacle of the profession. And then there were junior officers. The senior most officer within those was half the age of the captain, 29 years old. So why didn't you speak up? Because if I did, I will be exposed, because I know so little as compared to the captain. So what is the point in saying anything to him, the person who's been doing this job day in and day out? So I just leave it to him. So you create these subcultures, but then you don't realize that just by virtue of their expertise, there is no common language in this culture. So you have an expert working alongside a novice, for example, and there's no common language. So how would somebody speak up when there is no shared understanding, Laksh? We keep coming back to that.
Mm, yeah.
There is no shared understanding.
I know we've gone way over beyond our scheduled time, but I'm just loving the conversation. I want to go into different rabbit holes. But let me ask one final question, which is, the Cybersyn community is a community of technology entrepreneurs and executives. And to me, it's very clear that some of these insights you've gleaned from your own professional journey and life experiences, like just the one that you just dropped, that has profound implications on cybersecurity and even technology professionals. I think there's a lot more that we can learn from you. What advice would you have for our community members who are technology professionals, cybersecurity executives? What is one thing that they can change in their own day professional approach or anything in that regard so that they can start moving in this direction?
Yeah, I could say many things, Laksh. The thing that I would like to say is this, is that, I don't know if you can see it, but I can probably send you. So it's
Sure.
also the make space for listening and learning in life.
Mm.
Don't be afraid of letting go. I think that's, and no matter how many times you've seen people making the same mistake, see every incident, every situation as a new opportunity to understand that person. I cannot tell you how many times a conversation can reveal something completely new.
Yes.
It's going with this mindset that I already know what the issue is. It's ruining many relationships. Forget about organizations. And I've been married to my wife for the last how many years now? 2003 I know her from. In 2005 we got married, and it's 2025. Each day I'm learning something new about her.
Yes.
It's remarkable when you listen, when you learn to have a conversation, how much you can draw from that person, how much you can learn from them, and how much they can learn from you. So every conversation can be an opportunity for immense learning if you understand the art of listening and learning, and relearning and unlearning. I think that's what it is. Yeah, that's
Awesome.
what I like.
That's the fantastic takeaway message to our listeners. Before we wrap, Nippin, any other closing remarks or any other questions that I should have asked that I didn't?
No. Yeah, it's been I knew this is going to be a fantastic conversation, and it has been. Happy to
Awesome.
to introduce you to people. I love coaching and learning and unlearning with people together. It's so much fun.
Awesome. Nippin, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your insights and journey. Thank you so much.